LinkedIn Echo Chamber. This is Emma like Team Spirit. This evening, I have Tristan with me. Tristan, how are you doing?
Yeah, very well. Thanks, John. How are you?
Really good, thank you. Thank you for participating in this, and thank you for the support. Tristan, you have an online persona, the data translator, which is why you're here. It's the first time you've been with me, so perhaps it would be good if you could spend 60 seconds introducing yourself and your alter ego, please.
Yeah, awesome. So, the data translator came about because I found that I was good at being able to explain complex topics in a simple way, and it ultimately ended up being my LinkedIn persona when I was out of work and decided that I needed a personal brand. So I've now been posting on LinkedIn for 3 or 4 years, and it's just grown legs from there, which is pretty awesome, and has given me opportunities like this one. Uh, my general background, I started out in energy forecasting. I've done a couple of other roles, but I'm now working for a company called Kite Packaging. We sell packaging to businesses, and I'm leading a team of analysts there to help us look at all of our data and make better commercial decisions with it.
Love it. Well, look, you've really peaked by appearing on this podcast, Tristan. So I think you'll struggle to beat this, I think. So
Yeah, it doesn't get better than you.
congratulations on all that and welcome. Well, I invited you here because you have a technical background, you do analytics every day, and you have this other side, which is really focusing on the stakeholders and the business folk getting more from analytics. So the topic of this one I wanted to talk about is really how to help people understand how they can get more from their data team, how to have more fruitful relationships with the team. So this is something that you post quite frequently about. So can I ask you to set it up a little bit, please? And like, what would be a good jumping in point for this topic?
Yeah, I think it's a really good one. I think there's loads of business stakeholders out there who get massively frustrated with data teams. They see data teams as gatekeepers. They see them taking far too long to be able to get them any answers. They see them providing wrong answers or answers that don't meet the questions that they're really trying to solve. And quite often they see them as really technical people who are unable to actually understand what they mean and start talking in coding languages or telling them about all the different types of data storage we could have when there's no real business impact to a stakeholder who cares about sales or about minimizing cost or anything like that. So I think there's huge frustrations from business stakeholders in that relationship. And I think there's frustrations the other way as well, which we could talk about, but it ultimately leads to this bit of friction and a bit of a gap between the two parts of the business, when the reality is we should be collaborating as one and being able to work really effectively together.
Well, Tristan, let me show my age. So, look, I'm old enough to remember when data science was invented, and I think it brought with it or the name. Sorry, like I should say, I'm not like 300 years old. Like statistics was invented a long time ago, but the term data science brought with it this impression of like data is like wizardry, and it kind of put a bit of a block up for people. So, for folk trying to, I don't know, overcome these frustrations of either working with data folk or just getting better results from those relationships, what can they start with first? Let's run through a bunch of tips for them. What would be first on your list as something they can adopt to, have a better start straight out the gate?
I think having real clarity on what you want from a data team or what kind of their goal is in the operation. Equally, if you're going to ask them something, it's knowing really clear what outcome you're trying to achieve from it, and not to be afraid of sharing that with them. Quite often, stakeholders will share a more specific request with the data team rather than telling them the context around it, and are then surprised when it doesn't necessarily come back in that context. Like they've answered a different question because they haven't understood it. So I think that's a really good starting point, is under that clarity around it.
And what about an example for that? So you've done analytics for a long time. What about this case of the question never quite has the correct context? Is there one you can think of?
Yeah, I've got a really good simple example, which is one of my bosses once asked for a bit of information, wanted to see a load of sales data for something, and wanted it back in a spreadsheet. Just give me a dump of the data. And I had literally a 2-minute conversation on like, what are you actually trying to achieve? And they wanted some data to kind of show off the business and how well it was performing. And ultimately, I just gave them a PowerPoint slide with a design on already that kind of showed off that statistic in a way that I'd present it in a data storytelling style. So what was really a 5-minute request, but wouldn't have given them what they really needed, turned into a 2-minute conversation, still a 5-minute request, but actually gave them what they really needed and was a real solution for them to their actual problem rather than just being part of it.
Yeah, if I reflect on my life in marketing, I suppose a version of this is people being like, "Hey, can can I look at sales per year?" You're like, "Well, okay." It's like absolute
Yeah.
numbers. Doesn't really say too much. And you'd be like, well, "Where are you taking this?" Well, I want to look at growth. Like, try and decide if it's some sort of significant degree of growth. And you're like, so it's kind of like year over year. And they're like, "Yeah." And also, we changed things every year for the last 5 years, like new marketing channels, different investments. It's like, oh, so like the underlying stimulus of what you were trying to do in each year is completely different. Well, you can't just compare year over year very easily. Actually, we need to do something completely different. So it really reminds me of that type of case.
Yeah,
Um,
that's exactly it.
what about folks? I would like to have your opinion on kind of the data that's available for things. Um, sometimes, sometimes questions are a bit sometimes the questions are a bit random and they bear sometimes no relation to the data that you have. And then there's the other way around where the question is absolutely related only to the data that you have, but doesn't always see the bigger picture. Do you have an opinion on just like how people can think about this or get a better outcome of thinking about what data is even there?
Yeah, and I think there's one big mistake that people often make, which is using the data that is there to try and answer their question when it's a proxy for their question rather than getting the data that really answers their question. Although that data is often harder to find. So there are pros and cons to that, but that is often the case. We choose a proxy instead of really getting the data we actually need. So I think there's a balance here of, is that data available to answer your question? Is there a proxy available? Or is it worth the effort? Is the question that big that's going to have that big an impact to go and source the data and spend the time making sure you've got the data that really answers your question? So there is a balance and there is a range of things that you can do there. I think your other element to it of all the data's there and it's kind of, there's so much data that you need to then look at it from, understand that bigger picture and look at it from the angle that it's really being driven by rather than perhaps the angle that you maybe always look at the data.
Yeah, the potential impact of the project is a good tip. Yeah, because I suppose every analyst in the world is familiar with, there's usually like a data warehouse or similar everywhere that we work, and it kind of contains 90% of what we need.
Yeah.
But then a lot of questions involve this, building of a mini warehouse or data set on the side to kind of tackle these edge cases. And I suppose that can be really painful, take a long time. And if the juice isn't worth the squeeze, it's good to figure this out early. It reminds me of like when the data lake concept. The data lake concept was a paradigm to solve everything because all the data would be in one place. I've yet to meet anyone that says that was anything other than just creating a massive mess where there
Yeah,
was tons
tuck
of
it all
data
in.
that no one understood. Please comment. Anyone who thinks they crack data lakes, please leave a comment. I'd love to hear from you. Tristan, so there's this kind of data. What data do you need? What is it that you're trying to look at? There's then the understanding of the data. Now, this is something I've just seen even in the last weeks, and it's like how to interpret it. And sometimes there's like legacy knowledge around data. So, like, how would you bring this in, or what would your tips be to make sure that just it's very clear what should be worked on and the interpretation of that data?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think quite often as a junior analyst, you'd go into somewhere and not have that business context. And I'm sure we've probably all been through the phase of, I've found this really big problem with the business and we just need to solve it. And then you go and speak to someone who's been there for a little bit and they're like, no, that we all know about that. It's really obvious. Don't pull that thread. It's fine. You've not fixed the business. So there is that element of going and talking to people. It's the same with anything. And quite often there'll be people collecting data in the business, but you'll be quite far removed from them, and they'll be the people on the front line, probably don't even know what the data is being used for. So being able to actually go and talk to them, see how they collect it, what their challenges are, what are the potential pitfalls around it, I think they're the really useful things. It all comes down to that human connection and understanding of kind of source to ultimate output and insight. If you understand that full thread, you're going to make fewer mistakes.
So I think my next question was going to be, like, for a stakeholder, like what would separate for them like an awesome project from one that they found frustrating and crappy? But you might have just said it, because you sort of talked up the communication side of it. So if I said to you, like, what would just be a recap of the key things that stakeholders can kind of bring into their project planning for the data team to make sure they get great results? Can you like summarize them for me?
Yeah, I think the first one for me is always real clarity on what you're trying to achieve. So what's the big picture? And make sure you share that. Don't just come in with specific requests for what you think you need. Share the big picture, and the people in the data team will be able to help you get what you need to solve that. The second point that's really related to that is try and only solve one problem, like solve your big problem first. Quite often we go, oh, we could also do this with that and this and this, and you end up solving 4 problems badly rather than one problem really well. So keep it simple, have real clarity on what you're trying to do, and then work closely with the data team. If you've got those 2 things to start with, working in collaboration will help you produce a really successful project, and keeping up that communication. And from the data team, producing something quickly and being able to iterate and feedback on that really helps as well.
Good. Well, Tristan, thanks for those insights, and thanks for taking us through it. So I'm happy to have the data translator here telling us how it should be done. Tristan, I'd love to have you back, and I'd love to come at this from the other direction. So today we talked about the stakeholders. I would love to. We're going to do it. I would love to do from the other perspective. Clearly, the analytical people have a role in this. So I think what we do is record a part 2 where we come at it from that direction. It can't just be the stakeholders' responsibility to make sure the projects are awesome and have great outcomes. So we'll do that again. But for this time, thank you for your insights, Tristan, the data translator. Ladies and gents, this has been ML's Like Team Spirit.